Vice Premier Deng took it all in, waving his new Stetson hat, cowboy style.
Richard Nixon opened the door with his historic trip in 1972.
This was like going to the far side of the moon, the dark side of the moon. No one had seen anything of China since the bamboo curtain came down in 1948-49. And here we were, right, 23 years later, and no one had really been able to report, no American had really been able to report from China.
Indeed, since Mao Zedong's Communist Revolution in 1949, American journalists had been barred from China, forced to report from listening posts like the British colony of Hong Kong, reduced to swapping guesses with Western diplomats, interviewing refugees, and searching for clues in the propaganda of the Chinese Communist Party. Robert Elegant was based in Hong Kong from the 1950s to the 70s for Newsweek and the Los Angeles Times.
It was painstaking work. It was very painstaking work, Jesuitical, Talmudic, if you would have it, but intense examination of sources. And sometimes we missed them, sometimes we got them.
Ted Koppel was ABC's Hong Kong bureau chief in the late 1960s.
It was an enormously difficult story to cover, both in terms of content, but most especially in terms of picture. We couldn't get in.
Although the Nixon trip was a made-for-TV extravaganza and dozens of American journalists were allowed to accompany him, they had little chance to get a feel for what was really happening in China. Stanley Carno went for the Washington Post.
It has nothing to do with China watching. On the contrary, the least they wanted was any probing into what was going on in China. They wanted to make it a Nixon trip.
In the half-dozen years that followed the Nixon visit, a few American journalists were allowed to go to China as honored guests on brief, tightly controlled excursions.
You shot what the Chinese wanted you to shoot.
It was not until after Washington and Beijing established formal diplomatic relations in 1979 that things began to change.
There was the full normalization of relations between the United States and China in January of that year. And the Chinese then invited a selection, if you will, of all of the American journalists to come to Beijing.
Jim Laurie was ABC's Hong Kong correspondent. He and a dozen other American reporters were granted an unprecedented interview with China's new leader, Deng Xiaoping, who was about to embark on a visit to the U.S. Jay Mathews of the Washington Post also flew up from Hong Kong to cover the event. Like many others, he was bowled over by Deng.
The interview with Deng, he first shook hands with all of us as he came in. That was the lead of my piece. I shook hands with Deng Xiaoping. A historic figure was coming in and leading this, what appeared to be a surge of westernization in China.
The most amusing part about the whole session was Deng Xiaoping, he had a tendency to spit a lot. He smoked constantly his Panda cigarettes, and placed to his right was a gigantic spittoon. And you would stand up to ask your question. And while you were asking your question,
what is the Chinese position on the use of force?
He was waiting for the translation, of course. He would be gargling and getting together this giant wad of spit, which just before the translator began to translate your question, he would put into the spittoon next to him. And one China scholar, when I told him that story, said, actually, that's not unusual. He used to do that to keep people off balance. They would get confused when he was doing that. But later, there was the foreign ministry spokesperson who had arranged for the interview for us, came to the three networks and said, we only have one request of you. In the interest of friendship and cooperation, would you agree not to use any of the tape of Deng Xiaoping spitting and not to use the sound. And in the interest of friendship and cooperation, that first act of self-censorship was carried out.
Deng's U.S. trip and the way the press covered it was a watershed moment, solidifying in the eyes of the American public a new picture of China, not as an enemy, but a friend and an ally against the Soviet Union.
China's Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, who spent most of today in Houston, arrived in Seattle tonight, where he'll spend the final 2 days of his American tour before returning to Peking Monday. Jim Laurie has been traveling with the Vice Premier and reports on Deng's activities in Texas.
For excitement in Deng's Western weekend, it was hard to beat the Texas rodeo. We've got horse roping in Outer Mongolia, said one Chinese, but nothing quite like this.
It was almost like an American presidential trip in the sense that the networks and the other news agencies got together and rented a plane, and we flew behind Deng as reporters do with the White House.
Of all the reporters following Deng, John Roderick of the Associated Press stood out. He'd covered the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s and knew Chairman Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and other communist leaders.
Deng Xiaoping, he was a sharp little man with great sense of humor, brilliant as you could be. So this little man arrives in America, and the reaction of the American public and of the American newspapers to it were extraordinary.
Chinese Foreign Ministry official Yao Wei, who'd studied English at the American school in Beijing before the Communist Revolution, was in charge of Deng's press arrangements.
Deng is a very unique person, very deep-thinking person. I think he well knew of the past 20, 30, 40 years of animosity, and it's about time to change. And definitely, he wanted to change that.
The single most interesting stop was the Houston stop. Deng went to the Johnson Space Center, wanting to know, how the astronauts had gone to the moon and the space capsule, and how, he asked, which was very typical of him, how did they go to the toilet? He wanted to know. That was one of his key questions in Houston. And then the rodeo.
And Vice Premier Deng took it all in, waving his new Stetson hat, cowboy style. And he received a gift bull, $10,000 worth of Brahma. Deng noted breeding would result in even better U.S. China ties. Then aboard the old stagecoach for a swing around the arena. Deng, who had earlier visited the NASA Space Center, later remarked, it wasn't often that a Chinese could become an astronaut and a cowboy in one day.
That stood out as something, very American, cowboy hat.
And in a Chinese domestic context, simply putting the hat on was a daring act.
Yeah, he did it in a very charming way. Unlike a year or so before, one of our diplomats in Washington, D.C., had a picture taken with a cowboy hat and a cowboy shirt or anything, was criticized in China. A diplomat doing that, it's not something you should do, especially the Chinese diplomat. Well, Deng, he didn't mind.
The coverage was amazingly positive throughout that visit. I mean, Deng Xiaoping, cover of Time magazine during that trip, everywhere on television. This was the great reformer.
So the Chinese leave today with their memories and perhaps a new image for Communist China's leading man. For Deng Xiaoping not only went west, but went western.
Soon after, the Chinese government allowed American news organizations to open bureaus in Beijing. Time, which had just put Deng on its cover, sent Richard Bernstein, who had studied Chinese at Harvard and was then based in Hong Kong.
There was this tremendous hopefulness among a lot of people, academics, students of China, ordinary people who were charmed by the Chinese culture and Chinese civilization, who found something lovable in China that they would never have found in the Soviet Union.
The New York Times sent Fox Butterfield. Like Richard Bernstein, he had learned Chinese at Harvard and had been covering China from Hong Kong.
I always considered myself really fortunate, not only that I got to get into China and open the New York Times bureau there and be with the first wave of American correspondents to open news organizations in Beijing since '49. But to have arrived at precisely the moment when China was, for the first time since '49, opening itself up a bit.
Deng Xiaoping had just initiated the market reforms which, in the following decades, were to profoundly change the Chinese landscape. The newly arrived reporters and their editors back in New York were entranced. Melinda Liu, a Chinese-American from Ohio whose parents had fled the 1949 revolution, arrived for Newsweek.
The early 80s theme of China was, Deng Xiaoping on a roll, opening up, isn't it great, Sino-U.S. Love affair, that sort of a story.
Bruce Dunning, a veteran Vietnam War correspondent, opened the CBS bureau.
Early on, you could get almost anything on the air. There was just that novelty. It's, we have a bureau in Beijing. We have a presence in China. So they were willing to put almost anything on the air.
In the early days, the opening of China to the West, there was a gee whiz mentality. If you go back and you look at the programming on ABC and NBC and CBS in 1979, that is very much reflected. China opening up. Every little innovation that occurred in the late 70s that were part of the reform program that Deng was outlining were seized upon. The first private restaurant, the first private car, the first of this, it was all a series of firsts.
The Chinese are anxious, though, for anything new. Take the People's Hair Salon on Wang Fujin Street. For $2 and a good deal of agony, women are doing what was forbidden only 2 years ago: curls and a permanent wave.
But they wanted stories about the economic reforms. I remember writing a story about the first private restaurant that opened in Beijing. I still, I traveled around the country and did pieces about how life was changing. I remember I did a long 2-page piece on the restoration of a degree of religious freedom and the restoration of churches.
But the small American press corps quickly discovered that the experience of living in Beijing was very different than visiting China as an honored guest.
Returned and reopened the AP Bureau. It was the first time in 30 years that an AP man had a full-time bureau. Now, all the problems that were involved in setting up the bureau were quite extraordinary. The communists didn't know how to cope with this thing. They never had us there. But it was a big event, and everybody knew it was a big event. So they did everything they could to cooperate, but it was difficult.
Foreign residents were required to live in foreigners-only compounds. Since there weren't enough apartments available, the Chinese put them in a grimy, Stalinist-style hotel.
We definitely felt like pioneers, particularly those who came with kids and family, to be living in this Chinese hotel that was, it was the kind of hotel where the room boys would literally, it didn't matter, they would just come into your room to start cleaning, whether your door was locked, whether you were taking a bath, or whether you were changing your clothes. They would just, come in there. My room was infested by bats.
Graham Earnshaw was then a young reporter for the British news agency Reuters.
We were highly constrained, all of the journalists, the American journalists too, and so there was enormous frustration. We were all sort of trapped in these compounds in Beijing.
Well, how about a little on top of Old Smoky? Ready?
To CBS's Bruce Dunning, there was an incestuous quality to life within the tiny American press corps.
We lived in what we called the Chenmen Commune, the Chenmen Hotel, and most of us lived and worked there. So we would meet at breakfast, we'd meet at lunch, and we'd meet at dinner. And, we would be sort of watching who was coming and going. It was very much a communal type of living.
Jay and Linda Mathews faced a special problem. They were married and competitors. He worked for the Washington Post, she for the Los Angeles Times. Neither paper was happy.
The Washington Post had a tradition of correspondents had to sign a letter of understanding before they went off overseas. So there was a paragraph in my letter of understanding, which I signed, which said, "Don't you dare ever be beaten by your wife on any kind of story, and if you can beat her as often as possible, that's fine." And I signed that very happily. And you know, it was mostly, and we learned, as people know when they go overseas, that foreign correspondents do team up.
There was a night when we were at a party where the Boeing representative, another American, got a little drunk and started complaining about the disappearance of one of the Boeing 707s that the Chinese had purchased some years before, when they were actually setting up, you know, expanding their commercial airlines. So we kind of took him aside and said, "Well, tell us more about that. That's really fascinating. Where do you think the plane is? Did it crash?" And he said, "No, it's in a hangar in Shanghai, and they've dismantled it, and they're trying to design their own aircraft," which he said we at Boeing call the 708 because it's so much like the 707. So I remember going back to our hotel room that night and saying to Jay, "Well, we got to write it, and you know, obviously we have to get comment from Boeing." So we just split up the reporting tasks and shared notes. It was the most blatant collaboration I can think of our time there, and then delivered our separate stories to our desks and said, "This has to run tomorrow because," and we fully explained, this other guy has the story.
The Mathews partnership was a source of constant frustration for their arch rival, the New York Times' Fox Butterfield.
I sometimes felt outgunned, and I'd get a note from my editor saying, "The Washington Post has this story, and the LA Times has exactly the same story."
Also, the only time I ever remember Fox Butterfield really getting angry at us.
Right.
He sat in a chair and he said, "You guys are double teaming me, you know, and I don't like that."
After writing their story, the reporters also found that the logistics of simply filing in an impoverished third world country with primitive communications were a nightmare.
I would type it out on a electric typewriter in my hotel room. I would get on my bicycle, would ride to something called the Telegraph Building, the Denbao Dalo. And then there was like this huge lugubrious hall, very dark, and there'd be this clerk behind there. And sometimes the clerk would do the typing for me on a telex. But most of the time, I had to then retype the whole thing on a telex machine that spewed out this long tape that then had to be run back through the machine during the actual transmission. The whole thing it took hours. And sometimes the clerk wasn't there, or sometimes somebody was in line, so you had to wait for the telex machine. It was literally something out of the Stone Age.
There was never any censorship per se. You didn't have to submit scripts or stories to the authorities to have them go over them and vet them. But they made the gathering of news so difficult, the gathering of the stories, and the transmission. We had to, as I said, we had to order satellites a day or so in advance, and then before we could move the material on the satellite, they would ask us to play the piece, ostensibly for engineering purposes, to make sure the levels were correct and all of that, but it was obvious that they wanted to see what was going out. And if there had been something they didn't want to go out, well, there would have been technical difficulties.
But as they covered the dismantling of Chairman Mao's radical policies and breakthroughs such as the first Western-style jazz band in Shanghai, or the first Western fashion show in Beijing, the reporters found their biggest challenge was penetrating the wall the communist authorities were determined to maintain between the American journalists and their own people. Frank Ching, a Hong Kong-born Chinese who also covered the Deng Xiaoping press conference, opened the Wall Street Journal Bureau.
The first thing I had to do, of course, was go to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and I saw Yao Wei, who was head of the press department at that time, And he said something to me that I always remembered. He said, you can talk to anyone you like to in China. They don't need permission to talk to you. And I was so impressed. But then he didn't tell anyone else. So every time I talked to a Chinese, he would say, I don't have permission to talk to you. And I would say, but you don't need permission. Of course, nobody would believe it. So it got to the point where I would get the press department's phone number, and I would call that number and say, tell this man he doesn't need permission to talk to me.
It was forbidden for ordinary Chinese to talk to you. It wasn't, there's no law, as I say, but people were afraid. And everybody that was there at the time managed to find a few people who were brave enough to talk, and I had my few people like others did, and that was very, very important. But it was very, very hard to just have friends, and certainly even harder to develop sources.
Michael Parks had opened a bureau for the Baltimore Sun.
They'd be seen visiting with you or talking. That was a serious risk.
It's because of the past so many years of animosity. I don't think you can blame them. They're afraid to make mistakes.
The frustrated reporters did everything they could to break through the barriers.
It was very difficult to get to know people, and you would meet in parks or and that sort of thing. So it was very difficult. And for example, you couldn't invite a Chinese friend to your office or to your hotel or to your apartment. And it was very difficult to get in touch with people. It was almost impossible to have a real friendship with someone. I remember I was in a park one time with a Chinese friend, and we were talking, and there were people going past looking at us, and a couple of people came up to us and sort of said, "What are you doing?" And there was great suspicion of a foreigner meeting with a Chinese person.
I had heard that it was one way to try to talk to a Chinese was to take a train ride. So I was in Shanghai, went to Shanghai, and it was from Shanghai to Beijing was 20 hours by train in those days, or it was a 2-hour plane flight. So I decided I would take the train ride, and I could get to sit with a Chinese and get a story. But when I went to get on the train, there was the woman conductor, and she said, "Oh, you must be the American correspondent." And so clearly they had been keeping track of me, and she announced to all the passengers in the car, "We have an American on board. He's a foreign correspondent, and he speaks Chinese," basically giving the warning to all the passengers not to talk to me.
Melinda Liu had one advantage. As a Chinese American with the right clothing, she could pass for a local.
I mean, I'm an American-born Chinese. I look Chinese, so for me it was much simpler. But I still had to like put on a big old great coat with with a furry collar and a big hat and shoes. You know, your shoes always gave you away as a foreigner. So you had to wear Chinese shoes and slip out so that people thought you might be a local, because otherwise people would follow you. Find out who you talked to, find out what you said.
The Mathews found one other way to make connections, through their 2 small children.
To get back to the issue of whether having children gave us access, it did to some extent, because we could talk to their teachers. When we took them to play at the Temple of Heaven playground, it was somewhat easier just to strike up conversations with other parents who were there.
I had gotten to know Cao Yu, who was a well-known playwright. So I thought, okay, I'll interview him since I know him. And I asked him, can I interview you? He said, well, of course, but you need to get permission. So I called the information department and I said, I want to interview Cao Yu, but he's already agreed. This is just a formality. He needs your approval. And the man said, okay, we'll see. I guess a couple of days later he called back and he said, I'm sorry, Cao Yu is too busy to see you. I said, that's not possible. He's already agreed to see me. This is only a formality. I said, did you talk to him? So after he called me back a second time and said, no, he doesn't have time to see you, I said, I'm having lunch with him tomorrow. How can you say he doesn't have time to see me? And so the man said, well, if you're having lunch with him tomorrow, then you can interview him.
Still, the doors continued to open gradually. Liu Hongxing, who'd lived in China as a child before moving to the U.S., returned as the photographer for the AP and Time.
I think that period constitutes one of the best experience for me as a foreign correspondent. There are not a lot of this kind of hot news, spot news story. So we were able to kind of, decide for ourselves and decide for our editor what is interesting in China.
As an ethnic Chinese and a still photographer, Liu found it easier than his colleagues to blend in and capture the sense of change.
And there it was, this young man, roller skate by the Mao, and he was stretching out his arm, and he was passing Mao, and Mao was looking the other way, and the wind was blowing Mao's jacket in one direction. And this kind of just the position of the beginning of a new, freer era, which becomes quite iconic these days, and it's a photograph that you see everywhere.
NBC News sent Sandy Gilmore, its correspondent in Houston, to open a Beijing bureau.
You could go out on the street and you could shoot street scenes, bicycles, people walking, the cabbage piled up on the sidewalks in the wintertime for storage, stores and shops and so forth. But to actually get into a Chinese enterprise, to go out to a collective farm, to a factory, those kinds of things took weeks and weeks often of preparation, of phone calls, of begging and pleading and wheedling with the office in the foreign ministry that permitted correspondents to actually get out and do their business.
And leaving Beijing was even harder.
In those days, you needed travel permits to travel outside of Beijing. And basically anywhere past the Ming Tombs, you needed a permit. So the government would sometimes organize journalists to go and cover stories outside.
So whenever a group trip would come up, we jumped at those opportunities because you could go out and see a slice of Chinese life that you otherwise would not be able to see.
Within the Chinese bureaucracy, there were sharp debates over how much access the reporters should be given. In the Foreign Ministry's Information Department, Yao Wei argued for an easing of restrictions.
We always wanted the opening of more cities. 30 years ago, a lot of cities were not accessible to foreigners. Information Department was trying our best to do that. Arguing with them, what do you have to fear with people coming in? In many cases, it's not a fear of prying into state secrets. More of that were based on they don't want to see the poor conditions rather than anything else.
People will get very upset because they say I photograph, these very 落后, scenes of China, the backward scenes of China.
And the land suitable for farming, for forestation, for animal husbandry is 33.77 million mu.
The press tours had certain rituals. There was always the brief introduction by local officials, which often lasted for hours.
You go anywhere, the head of the commune, the head of the factory, will welcome you with a pretty long speech, starting with all those slogans under the guidance of the Communist Party of China, under the guidance of the thoughts of Mao Zedong, under another.
There was the cultural performance, with the reporters often pressed to join in. But slowly, painfully, the American correspondents began to penetrate beneath the surface as momentous changes got underway.
The special economic zones are a concession to capitalism. The Chinese have bent the rules to attract a wide variety of foreign investment.
As part of his reforms, Deng Xiaoping authorized the establishment of special zones to experiment with market-style economics. The first one was in Shenzhen, just across the border from Hong Kong.
Shenzhen was nothing. It was a little village, very few people.
Shenzhen used to be little different from hundreds of other sleepy country towns in South China. But Shenzhen now is a boom town, a bold experiment by Chinese leaders.
They were laying out their blueprints and telling us where they're going to build a highway and where they're going to build a Holiday Inn hotel and a convention center, where they're going to build the port. And the reaction, the silent, sort of long reaction from my colleague was that, yeah, right.
We totally underestimated the ability of China to change rapidly.
Some of the most dramatic changes began to unfold in the countryside, where Deng Xiaoping authorized the breakup of that symbol of Maoist extremism, the People's Communes.
The People's Commune system, the intense collectivization of the countryside, was such an icon of Maoism and you know, that whole Soviet-style political approach. The fact that it was being broken up into family-based farms, which turned out to be hugely much more productive than the big collectives, I thought was very telling.
We went out into the countryside and showed how the communes were beginning to break up and how people were beginning to have private land, you know, their own personal parcels of land and their own flocks of animals. And so we were able to show how the cooperative, the commune system was beginning to break down.
Wrote stories about what happened in the countryside when farmers were able to grow additional rice and sell it. And so there were booming market towns. Remember one story, going down to Anhui province and doing a story, and I think the lead was all the little piglets on the back of bicycles going off to market because they could use that extra grain to raise pigs and sell them on the market.
The arrival of the resident U.S. correspondents also coincided with the launch of China's draconian one-child family planning policy. It was hugely controversial and a major story.
More on this decree from Sandy Gilmore in Peking.
Every day, China's population increases by 32,000 people. The growth rate threatens the country with economic disaster, and the Communist Party wants the growth stopped. In recent pronouncements, China's leaders have made it clear that preventing pregnancy is the business of the state. Vice Premier Chen Muhua said China's socialism requires that the production of human beings be planned like the production of material goods.
We went to a family so-called planning hospital in Beijing and got exclusive photos of the women there, many of whom who had had to have forced abortions, forced sterilizations, and so on, in order for the Chinese to accomplish their one child per family policy. And went to the neighborhood, where the neighborhood official and busybody is keeping track of all the women in the neighborhood and their menstrual cycles, with a chart up there stating who is authorized to have a child and who isn't. It was just extraordinary, and that was, I thought, a very important story, and showed that while China was talking about reforming, the power of the state had just such a broad reach that it was formidable indeed.
But like so much in China, as they dug deeper, the reporters discovered the reality was more complex.
And both of us, like our newspapers, were really keen on what was finding out how people actually lived in these countries, looking for contrast between the way people lived and what the government said about the way people lived, looking for cracks in the facade in certain policies, like the one child per family policy. Early on we did stories about how in the countryside that wasn't operating at all.
As somebody said once when we were interviewing at a commune where the commune leader's wife was pregnant with her fourth child, the mountains are tall and the emperor is far away. And so they knew very well that they were going to get away with, with violating the one child rule.
But for every story the foreign correspondents could do in China, many more remained out of reach. Their struggles with Communist Party cadres, or cadres as English-speaking Chinese called them, left many journalists weary.
We were all controlled by a group of Communist Party officials, apparatchiks, our minders, and they were all dressed in exactly the same way, and right across China they were operating according to exactly the same mindset.
The personal restrictions that we operated under, you know, the constant surveillance, phones always being tapped, people always listening in on you, you know, simple things like you couldn't have a normal romantic relationship with a Chinese person.
My staff consisted of a Chinese assistant and translator who actually worked for the security people, and his main job was to spy on me.
We all felt that it'd be a good idea to be on good terms with your translator so he wouldn't give you a bad report.
Some of the Americans found an unlikely source of help in getting a better handle on the country, a trio of young Filipinos. Chito Romana, Eric Baculinao, and Jaime Floracruz had been among a group of left-wing students from Manila on a friendship tour of China in 1971, when they learned Philippine strongman Ferdinand Marcos had ordered their arrest if they returned.
We were on the wanted list. I was one of the wanted list to be arrested on arrival, so we decided to wait on, thinking that it might normalize in a few months. It turned out to be 15 years waiting in China.
By the time the American correspondents arrived, all three had graduated from Chinese universities, were fluent in Chinese, and offered the reporters an alternative window into the country.
I hired a Filipino who had been here for many years, Jimmy Floracruz, who now is the CNN bureau chief. He, having lived in China for, you know, more than a decade, by that time had some friends, knew some people.
So I had this huge network of friends that I could turn to for information or just to double check certain news or rumors. People who trusted me because they knew me first as a friend and later as a journalist. So that was my big advantage.
Jimmy was the first one who did it because he was working for Melinda of Newsweek, and then eventually for Time. And it was through him, you know, other journalists were asking him, where can we find people like you?
Romana ended up at ABC News, while Sandy Gilmore hired Eric Baculinao at NBC.
Oh, the old telex machine is an antique. It's, that's why it was confiscated, taken back by the Chinese government, because I think it belongs to the Ching dynasty era.
He was just my right-hand man during my entire stay in China, with me on just about every story.
But even with the extra help, China remained a tough assignment.
I think most of us who came in the 79-81 period were very, I mean, we had sort of followed China on the outside for so many years, and we were very enthusiastic about China. And then it sort of ground us down.
These sorts of things, I think some people reacted against in a very visceral way. You know, they felt betrayed by China, and some of them became very bitter about China.
Living in the same grim hotels, often traveling on the same staged trips, fighting the same bureaucratic battles against the Qatars, the increasingly cynical reporters fell back on one another for support.
Quiet! Quiet! That's it!
And entertainment.
Now here's a little story. Please listen to me do. It's revolutionary and socialistic too. About my dear old father. At skiving he's the best. And when it comes to Guanxi, he's got more than all the rest. More than the rest. Oh, my old man's a Carter. He wears a Carter's hat. He has a big black limo with curtains in the back. And when I am a Carter, I'll be the same way too. And as for serve the people, I've got better things to do.
Some of these folks were just real characters with very strong personalities. And again, I think some of the personalities come out a little bit more when you're living in conditions like that and you're all sharing this kind of common bond of continual Chinese inconvenience.
Oh, when I am a Carter, I'll wear a Carter's hat and give out lots of orders to the proletariat. And all you foreigners will be beneath my dignity. And I will sit in your seat there and you can wait.
It's kind of standard, no matter where they are, for the foreign press corps to develop a slight contemptuous attitude of the host country. Contemptuous might be too strong a word. But yeah, we did have it. And we certainly shared our view of the information department, which we used to call the lack of information department.
It was easy to make fun of the system, but the grievances of those victimized by the extremism of the Cultural Revolution, voiced most dramatically in the posters on Beijing's Democracy Wall, were no laughing matter.
There was this sudden outpouring of posters. For the first time since 1949, since the Communist Revolution, they were able to put up what they really felt and tell stories about it, what had happened to them. And there was just amazing sentiments that were going up. The Chinese had not been able to talk publicly for 20, 30 years.
And people were writing posters and pasting them on the Democracy Wall. And a lot of those people were interested in meeting and talking to foreign journalists.
Some TV reporters, however, found their bosses so enamored of the romance of China, they weren't interested in the human rights story.
Whenever I would propose stories that touched on human rights issues or much more critical stories, there wasn't a tremendous enthusiasm for those kind of stories in New York. Now, partly it was being television. You didn't really have pictures to tell the story. There were so many wonderful images in China which Americans had not seen, right? That to do a story on a lone dissident, which was not very telegenic, if you will, was a problem.
Liu Ching was one of those lone dissidents, a prominent Democracy Wall activist. Several weeks after giving an interview to Richard Bernstein, Liu was arrested and sentenced to 3 years of re-education through labor. Midway through his term, a prison journal he kept was smuggled out.
He gave it to a fellow inmate who wrapped it around his leg underneath his quilted clothes when he was released from prison. And the inmate then gave it to some friends. I think maybe Liu Ching had a brother living in Beijing, so he gave it to his brother.
Eventually, the document was delivered to Bernstein, who published excerpts in Time magazine.
It was my big scoop during my time in China. We had this kind of detailed description of the Chinese, the arrest, the interrogation, the imprisonment, the so-called trial, the imprisonment, the terms of imprisonment, everything, the whole story was there, written by an extremely intelligent, a very honest guy, too.
Bernstein was called in and interrogated by the police.
I didn't name any names or anything like that during that meeting. I was fully prepared to go to prison if I had to, not to disclose any names, but it was a kind of silly bravado on my part because they knew all the names.
Liu Ching served 11 years before being freed. In 1992, he was allowed to go to the United States. He holds no bitterness towards Richard Bernstein.
波尔斯坦把这个东西带到国际上来，使外国知道了对中国政府的揭露呢是有益的，所以呢，和我想做的是一致的，因此我很感激他，而不是生气。
Still, Liu Ching's fate underscored one of the central dilemmas faced by foreign reporters in China, the danger in an authoritarian system of putting your contacts at risk.
I was very wary of trying to involve a sort of an average Chinese in any kind of a controversial story. I just feared they would be picked up and jailed, and I didn't feel that I could live with that.
I couldn't accept the moral responsibility of causing that.
Most of us disguised our sources very, very carefully when we wrote about them. But we saw what happened when it wasn't adequate enough.
Fox Butterfield met a young woman willing to talk about one of the most taboo of all topics, sex in China.
If you talked about sex, I mean, you couldn't. The clothes were designed to look sexless. There was no open displays of affection. There was no dancing. Sex was considered bourgeois. But I soon discovered that Chinese, of course, had active sex lives and had certain interests. And this woman was, for whatever her personal reasons, she felt very comfortable talking about Chinese sexual mores. And we probably got careless because We met probably too often, and we probably became too confident that we were able to keep our meetings away from prying eyes. So in the end, I mean, she did get arrested. That weighed on me a lot. I mean, it's weighed on me for years.
But even as Deng Xiaoping crushed the Democracy Wall protests and reporters and their contacts struggled with the heavy hand of the state, Deng continued to liberalize the economy and to dismantle Chairman Mao's radical legacy, a cycle of tightening and opening that became and remains a central feature of China's reform process. While dissidents came under pressure, Deng put Mao's widow, Ching, and her key allies, the so-called Gang of Four, on trial, blaming them for the excesses of the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. Millions of Chinese had suffered then, among them an uncle of Melinda Liu.
You know, like my own uncle, who was in Shanghai, he had been an official in the Shanghai Health Bureau system. He had been criticized very intensely during the Cultural Revolution. He'd been branded a rightist. He'd been an intellectual. He was trained as a doctor, and he was sent down to Xinjiang to work in the fields.
The trial of the Gang of Four was a big story, a national political catharsis after years of upheaval, but foreign reporters were barred from attending the proceedings.
This was an amazing event. Mao's widow, the Gang of Four, all the conspirators on trial in the big courthouse just off of Tiananmen Square, and yet we as foreign journalists had no access whatsoever.
When the Gang of Four had their trial, we weren't allowed to be there. It wasn't televised live, but you saw news clips of it at night. And so then I would write my story after we watched the news clips.
The American networks were desperate for footage. The state-run China Central Television was the only source.
A major battle developed with CCTV over access to the video of the trial. At one point, video came out showing Jiang Jing in her cell, and a bidding war began between ABC and CBS on acquiring this video, which we desperately wanted. CBS in this case won the bidding war, and I lost.
But CCTV's display of newfound entrepreneurial tendencies was a good metaphor for what was beginning to happen all across China. To spearhead his reform drive, Deng Xiaoping promoted two younger officials. Hu Yaobang was made General Secretary of the Communist Party, and Zhao Ziyang, the party boss in Sichuan, China's most populous province, was named Premier. In a sign of the changing times, just before taking up his new job, Zhao Ziyang agreed to talk to Fox Butterfield.
To my surprise, I was told that I was going to have a meeting with Zhao Ziyang, and then the next thing I knew, this man appeared in my hotel. And he came by himself, which was astonishing. According to Chinese protocol, the senior Chinese leader would not come to the hotel of a lowly foreign correspondent. So I was really stunned, and I was very impressed that he was willing to open himself up, and we had a fairly frank, engaging talk about the economic reforms he was carrying out and how they were going, and how optimistic he was and the big changes he wanted to make.
Indeed, that was the big theme as this first generation of American reporters began to wind up their groundbreaking assignments.
I would say I was optimistic. I felt that China was had an opportunity to head in a positive direction.
We were fairly hopeful, I think, leaving.
The economy was improving, the free markets were functioning, there were some private plots, there were more choices available to individuals about where they worked, there were more people going to college. There were lots of things to indicate that China was on an upward trajectory.
Even the government's handling of the media began to improve.
I thought when I left in '83 that China was just beginning to open up to journalists. '83 was when they began to have regular press conferences. The foreign ministry had a weekly press conference. That was when they appointed spokesmen for all the ministries and gave out phone numbers. And before that, none of this was available.
Still, covering China remained a struggle. Some correspondents believed the continuing restrictions obscured even the good news.
And because we didn't have the kind of access, the Chinese really, they sort of shoot themselves in the foot in a way too here, because they don't, they want to control you so much that, you feel that whatever they tell you is a lie. And even when it's the truth.
Yet as the Mao years faded into memory, the dominant theme in the China of Deng Xiaoping was hope.
I have a photograph showing this high school student sitting on the floor in Tiananmen Square and studying. That was when they first reinstituted the college exam, but they have no electricity at home. They go to Tiananmen Square and they study under the street light. As a photographer, I was very moved.
Lights, camera, action. It's a scoop, it's a story, it's got drive, it's got speed, it's a shock or a drama that'll make your poor heart bleed. It's a must, stop the presses, oh now this you've got to read. It's a ball-tearing monster, it's a front page lead. You've got to get the facts right and you've got to write it quick. Just add a few fast cliches and it's bound to read real slick. You may wonder how one judges if a story's really hot. Does it grab you by the short and hairies? Write it on the spot. It's said the subs are there to stop the errors creeping in. It seems to me they're there to help the dreaded gremlin. The way they spike and mutilate my stories shows they're fiends. Sub stands not for sub-editor, subhuman's what it means. It's a scoop, it's a story, it's got drive, it's got speed, it's a shock or a drama that'll make your poor heart bleed. It's a must, stop the presses, oh now this you've got to read. It's a bull-tearing monster, it's a front page lead. Before you all decide you want to be a journalist, you've got to learn to drink your fill and more and not get pissed. The job consumes your interest, can consume your life as well. The burnt-out journalist lives in a special kind of hell. But the dinky-die reporter chases stories till he drops. While there's news left to be written, you can bet he never stops. Even when the paper's put to bed and the presses spring to life, you'll find the true blue journalist still saying to his wife, it's a scoop, it's a story, it's got drive, it's got speed, it's a shock or a fucking drama, make your poor heart bleed. It's a must, stop the presses, oh now, this you've got to read. It's a ball-tearing bloody monster, it's a front